The latest national polling reveals an incredibly tight race at the top, with the Liberal Party and Conservative Party deadlocked at 38% each. However, with a 4% margin of error, their actual support is anywhere between 34% and 42%, meaning that either party could have the edge depending on how the numbers shift. This statistical tie highlights the uncertainty in the race and the potential for volatility as the campaign unfolds. Meanwhile, the New Democratic Party, NDP, sits at 11%, but with a 2% margin of error, their real support could be as low as 9% or as high as 13%. While the party remains in third place, this suggests they may be losing momentum compared to previous standings, making their path forward more challenging. The Bloc Québécois, which runs candidates exclusively in Quebec, holds 7% nationally with a 1% margin of error, placing their actual support between 6% and 8%. Their influence will largely depend on how their numbers translate within Quebec's ridings. The Green Party registers 4% support, but with a 2% margin of error, their real level of backing could range between 2% and 6%. Though their national numbers remain modest, they could still play a role in key ridings, particularly where voter preferences are split. With the two leading parties locked in a statistical tie and margins of error leaving room for movement, this race remains highly competitive. Even a small shift in voter support could tip the balance, making every percentage point crucial as the campaign progresses. In Atlantic Canada, the Liberal Party holds a commanding lead with 52% support, but with a 7% margin of error, their actual support could range anywhere between 45% and 59%. This suggests a strong advantage, but also leaves room for potential shifts. The Conservatives follow at 32%, with a 6% margin of error, meaning their real support could be anywhere from 26% to 38%. While they are significantly behind the Liberals, their numbers are still competitive in certain areas, and any momentum shift could narrow the gap. The New Democratic Party, NDP, sits at 9%, but with a 3% margin of error. Their true level of support could be between 6% and 12%. This places them well behind the two frontrunners and suggests a downward trend in the region. Meanwhile, the Green Party registers 4% support with a 2% margin of error, putting their real level of backing anywhere between 2% and 6%. While their numbers are modest, they could still influence the outcome in key ridings. With the Liberals maintaining a significant lead, the question is whether the Conservatives can close the gap or if the current trend will hold until Election Day. In Quebec, the Liberal Party leads with 36% support, but with a 5% margin of error. Their actual support could be anywhere between 31% and 41%. This positions them ahead of their rivals, but the race remains competitive. The Bloc Québécois follows at 28%, with a 4% margin of error, meaning their real support could range between 24% and 32%. While trailing the Liberals, the Bloc remains a major force in Quebec politics, and small shifts in voter sentiment could bring them closer. The Conservatives hold 23% support, also with a 4% margin of error, placing their actual backing between 19% and 27%. While they remain in third place, their numbers indicate a strong base in the province. The New Democratic Party, NDP, sits at 8%, with a 3% margin of error, meaning their support could be anywhere from 5% to 11%. These numbers suggest limited growth for the party in the province. Meanwhile, the Green Party holds 3% support, with a 2% margin of error, putting their real range between 1% and 5%. While their numbers are modest, they could still impact tight races. With the Liberals leading but the Bloc still competitive, Quebec remains a battleground where voter shifts could significantly impact the final results. In Ontario, the race is incredibly close, with the Liberal Party leading at 42%, but with a 6% margin of error, their actual support could range between 36% and 48%. The Conservatives are just behind at 40%, also with a 6% margin of error, meaning their support could be anywhere from 34% to 46%. This statistical tie makes Ontario a crucial battleground where even small shifts could determine the outcome. The New Democratic Party, NDP, sits at 11% with a 3% margin of error, placing their real support between 8% and 14%. Their numbers suggest they are struggling to gain ground in the province. Meanwhile, the Green Party registers 4% support with a 3% margin of error, putting their real range between 1% and 7%. The People's Party of Canada, PPC, sits at 3%, also with a 3% margin of error, meaning their support could range from 0% to 6%. While still a minor player, they could influence tight races. With the Liberals and Conservatives locked in a dead heat, Ontario is shaping up to be one of the most decisive battlegrounds in the election. In the Prairies, the Conservatives lead with 49% support, but with a 6% margin of error. Their actual support could range between 43% and 55%. The Liberals follow at 31% with a 5% margin of error, meaning their support could be between 26% and 36%. The NDP stands at 13% with a 4% margin of error, placing their range between 9% and 17%. Meanwhile, the Green Party holds 3% support with a 2% margin of error, meaning they could be anywhere from 1% to 5%. The Conservatives maintain a strong lead, but the Liberals have gained ground in the region. In Alberta, the Conservatives lead with 55% support, but with a 6% margin of error. Their actual support could range between 49% and 61%. The Liberals follow at 27%, with a 5% margin of error, meaning their support could be between 22% and 32%. The NDP sits at 11% with a 3% margin of error, placing their range between 8% and 14%. The Conservatives remain dominant in Alberta, but the Liberals have made gains in the province. In British Columbia, the Conservatives lead with 41% support, but with a 6% margin of error. Their actual support could range between 35% and 47%. The Liberals are close behind at 36%, also with a 6% margin of error, meaning their support could be between 30% and 42%. The NDP sits at 15% with a 4% margin of error, placing their range between 11% and 19%. Meanwhile, the Green Party holds 6% support with a 3% margin of error, meaning they could be anywhere from 3% to 9%. With the Conservatives and Liberals in a tight race, the final outcome remains uncertain. In the territories, the Liberal Party leads with 41% support, but with a 9% margin of error, their actual support could range between 32% and 50%. The Conservatives follow at 29% with an 8% margin of error, meaning their support could be between 21% and 37%. The NDP sits at 22% with a 7% margin of error, placing their range between 15% and 29%. Meanwhile, the Green Party holds 6% support with a 4% margin of error, meaning they could be anywhere from 2% to 10%. With wide margins of error, shifts in support could make a big difference in the territories.